When Helena's son, Constantine the Great, rose to power, the Roman world stood on the edge of transformation. For nearly 3 centuries, Christianity had survived underground, whispered in candlelit catacombs, symbolized by carved fish on hidden walls, carried in secret prayers beneath the empire's marble floors. Believers lived in fear, yet their faith endured. Then, in one moment, everything changed. History remembers it as the vision at the Milvian Bridge, a story that still echoes across the centuries. According to ancient accounts, as Constantine prepared to face his rival Maxentius in battle, he looked toward the sky and saw something extraordinary. A cross, shining above the setting sun, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Imagine that, a soldier emperor, hardened by years of war and politics, standing beneath the Roman sky, and seeing a symbol that would alter the course of civilization. That night, Constantine ordered his men to mark their shields with the sign of the Chi, the first 2 Greek letters of Christ. When dawn came, the armies clashed on the Tiber River, and Constantine emerged victorious. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD wasn't just a triumph of arms, it was a triumph of belief. From that moment, the tide of history shifted. Pagan temples would slowly give way to basilicas. Crosses would rise where idols once stood. And Rome, once the seat of emperors who hunted Christians, would become the heart of the Christian world. But, as with all great transformations, there's a story behind the story, because while Constantine saw a vision in the sky, someone else had planted the seed of that vision long before. That someone was his mother, Helena. She wasn't a philosopher or a general. She didn't write decrees or command legions, yet her influence reached deeper than any law or army ever could. Helena lived her faith not with spectacle, but with steadfastness. She embodied humility in a world obsessed with power, compassion in a culture that prized conquest, and forgiveness in an empire built on control. Historians often debate how much Helena's example shaped her son's beliefs. But imagine growing up watching a woman who had once been of lowly birth, perhaps a stable-maid, perhaps an innkeeper's daughter, carry herself with quiet dignity and unwavering faith. A woman who never needed to shout about her God, because her actions spoke louder than words. Constantine may have seen a cross in the heavens, but he had already seen one, reflected in the way his mother lived. Maybe that's why the emperor who commanded armies would later build churches, why the ruler of a brutal empire would declare tolerance for a once persecuted faith, why the man called the Great would kneel before the God his mother had served in silence. It's easy to focus on the miracle, the blazing sky, the divine message, the victorious battle. But perhaps the real miracle was quieter, a mother's enduring example, shaping the soul of an empire through the simple act of belief. Because faith doesn't always begin with visions. Sometimes it begins with someone watching you pray when you think no one's looking. Helena's story reminds us that transformation often starts in the unseen, in the private moments of grace that ripple outward until they reshape history itself. So when Constantine rode beneath that fiery cross, maybe he wasn't just following a vision from the heavens. Maybe, in some way, he was following her, and perhaps that's what makes their story timeless. The emperor who conquered Rome, and the woman whose faith conquered his heart. Think about it. How many times in history has power been influenced not by those who ruled, but by those who believed? Helena never wore a crown. She never led a legion, but her faith, quiet, persistent, unshakable, helped turn the greatest empire on earth toward a new kind of light. And maybe that's the real message of this chapter in history, that the mightiest revolutions don't always begin on battlefields. Sometimes they begin beside a humble bed, with a woman on her knees, whispering a prayer that the world would one day remember. When history speaks of Constantine the Great, it often tells the story of an emperor, the man who saw a cross in the sky, who turned the tide of empire, who gave Christianity a throne. But behind every empire there's a quieter story, one that doesn't march with armies or carve monuments in stone. This one begins not with a sword, but with a mother's faith. Constantine and Helena were more than emperor and empress dowager. They were, in a sense, partners in a spiritual revolution. He ruled the empire with authority. She guided it with conviction. He built cities, she built sanctuaries. He signed decrees, She lived devotion. Together they reshaped the soul of Rome. In 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, a proclamation that changed the course of history. For the first time, Christians, once hunted and humiliated, could worship openly, without fear of chains or fire. The underground faith that had survived in shadows stepped into the light. It was a moment of liberation, but also of redefinition. Rome, the empire of Jupiter and Mars, was now home to the followers of Christ. Think about how staggering that was. For nearly 1,000 years, Roman identity was built upon the old gods. Every victory was dedicated to Jupiter. Every battle cry invoked Mars. Every festival honored Venus or Apollo. To be Roman was to worship that pantheon. And now, an emperor stood before the world declaring allegiance to the god of a once persecuted minority. That wasn't just politics. It was a revolution of belief. Yet Constantine's transformation didn't happen in isolation. While he was reshaping laws and borders, Helena was reshaping hearts. In the years following her son's decree, she became a force of compassion and faith. She used her imperial influence not to accumulate power, but to build churches, charities, hope. Across the empire, her touch could be seen, from the construction of new sanctuaries in Rome to her later pilgrimage to the Holy Land. She funded the poor, freed captives, and turned the concept of Christian mercy into something tangible, visible, touchable, real. If Constantine gave Christianity political legitimacy, Helena gave it a soul, and that's something we rarely think about when we talk about revolutions. Power alone doesn't transform civilizations. Values do. Helena understood that faith couldn't survive on laws or monuments alone. It needed empathy. It needed beauty. It needed the example of a life lived differently. Some sources describe her walking through the streets of Rome, not as a royal figure demanding honor, but as a motherly presence, offering food to beggars, comforting widows, helping orphans. Imagine what that must have looked like. The mother of the emperor, once rumored to be of humble birth, now dressed in imperial robes, yet kneeling beside the poor in the streets. It wasn't spectacle, it was sincerity. Through her actions, Helena became something Rome had rarely seen, a model of gentle power. Not the power that conquers, but the power that uplifts. And in a world that had worshipped strength above all else, that was perhaps the most radical act of all. Historians sometimes describe their relationship as two halves of the same mission. Constantine was the architect of the Christian empire. Helena was its heart. He gave the faith legitimacy. She gave it humanity. One wielded the authority to change laws. The other carried the grace to change lives. Their partnership shows us something profound, that true transformation requires both vision and virtue. One without the other collapses. Constantine's decree could have been forgotten, ignored, or corrupted, if not for the faith that Helena kept alive. Not through words, but through example. And maybe that's why their legacy endures. Because in every cathedral dome, in every mosaic that gleams under candlelight, in every humble act of charity inspired by the early church, we can still see traces of both: the emperor's courage and his mother's compassion. It's tempting to think of history as the story of battles and empires, of rulers and revolts. But sometimes the greatest revolutions happen not in palaces or on battlefields, but in hearts. Helena and Constantine remind us of that truth. Together, they didn't just change a religion, they changed what power itself could mean. And in that partnership, between sword and cross, decree and devotion, emperor and mother, the world found a new kind of empire, one not ruled by fear, but inspired by faith. When you think of history's great transformations, remember, it's not always the crown that moves the world. Sometimes, it's the quiet prayer whispered behind the throne. Every great story, especially one that changes the world, eventually reaches a point where history and legend begin to blur. And Helena's story is no exception. So let's pause for a moment and ask the question every historian eventually must. How much of what we know about Saint Helena is fact, and how much is faith? Most of what survives about her comes from Eusebius of Caesarea, Constantine's own biographer. He paints Helena as almost angelic, pious, gentle, a woman of flawless virtue who embodied Christian ideals before they were ever fashionable in Rome. To Eusebius, she wasn't just an empress, She was a living sermon. But here's where the record gets murky. Many of the most famous parts of her story, like the legendary discovery of the true cross in Jerusalem, were written decades later by authors such as Rufinus, Ambrose, and others who lived long after Helena's death. Their versions are vivid and miraculous. Crosses discovered beneath the soil, healings, divine signs, stories meant to stir faith in the hearts of believers. And that's where the debate begins. Was Helena truly the one who found the cross on which Christ was crucified? Did Constantine really see that blazing sign in the sky? In this sign, conquer? Or were these stories carefully shaped afterward to give divine legitimacy to the empire's new faith? Historians have wrestled with these questions for centuries. Some argue that these were political tools, spiritual propaganda meant to justify Constantine's sudden embrace of Christianity. After all, a divine vision makes for a powerful origin story when you're founding a new religious empire. But others, and perhaps more sympathetically, believe that both mother and son were utterly sincere. That they did experience something beyond explanation, that they weren't trying to invent a myth. They were trying to make sense of what felt like a miracle. Because faith, after all, doesn't always unfold like a document in a library. It breathes, it moves, it grows through retelling. And maybe that's the deeper truth hiding beneath the contradictions. Whether Helena actually uncovered the true cross with her own hands, or whether that story blossomed over time, doesn't erase what her journey represents. She was a woman of humble birth who rose to the highest circle of power, not through ambition, but through conviction. A mother who turned influence into service. A pilgrim who transformed ancient ruins into places of worship. The details may shift like sand in the hands of history, but the meaning endures, because every civilization needs its stories, not to deceive, but to inspire. The Romans once told tales of Jupiter and Mars to explain strength and victory. The Christians, in turn, told stories of Helena and Constantine to express hope and redemption. And when you think about it, those stories didn't just fill scrolls. They built cathedrals, shaped cities, and gave ordinary people something to believe in when the world around them was falling apart. Maybe that's the real miracle. Think of it this way. Helena's journey, from obscurity to sainthood, became a mirror for millions who felt unseen, reminding them that faith could elevate even the humblest soul. And Constantine's vision, whether a literal blaze in the sky or a metaphor born of conscience, still speaks to the idea that transformation is possible, that even empires built on conquest can turn toward compassion. So perhaps the question isn't whether every detail is historically accurate. Perhaps the question is, what truth was so powerful that people refused to let it die? History gives us evidence, faith gives us meaning, and somewhere between those two, Helena and Constantine continue to live. One as a ruler who saw the light, and the other as a mother who carried it. When you strip away the miracles and politics, what remains is something profoundly human, the longing to connect heaven and earth, power and mercy, reason and wonder. Maybe that's why their story endures after 17 centuries. Not because it's perfect, but because it reflects us, our doubts, our hopes, our search for something greater than ourselves. So yes, historians can debate the dates, the sources, the miracles. But the impact? That part is undeniable. Because long after Helena's footsteps faded from the roads of Jerusalem, her influence still echoes in every church built on compassion, in every prayer whispered by someone who believes that the world can be changed not by might, but by faith. Whether miracle or myth, the transformation was real. And perhaps that's the truth that matters most. Maybe history doesn't need to prove the miracle, because sometimes the miracle is simply that the story still moves us. When Constantine looked out across his empire, he saw a world ready to be reborn. And from that vision came a city unlike any the world had ever seen, Constantinople, his new Rome. It was more than a capital. It was a statement, a bridge between East and West, between the old gods and a new faith. But if you look closely, beneath the marble, the mosaics, and the shimmering domes, you'll find traces of another hand, Helena's. Her influence didn't end with her lifetime. It was built into the very foundations of this new world. Everywhere you turned, the signs were there. Crosses rose where pagan statues once stood. Temples to forgotten gods became churches bathed in candlelight. Public squares that once echoed with the cries of gladiators now rang with hymns of mercy and hope. Helena's spirit was in that transformation, quiet, enduring, and deeply human. She may not have lived to see the full splendor of her son's empire, but her touch was unmistakable. It was in the architecture that blended grandeur with grace, in the art that turned eyes not toward emperors but toward heaven, in the moral shift that redefined Rome itself from a culture of domination to one that dared to speak of compassion. Think about what that meant. For centuries, the Roman world had measured greatness by power, by conquest, lineage, and bloodline. To be noble was to rule, to be holy was to win. And yet through Helena's life, that idea began to crumble. Because she embodied something the empire had never celebrated before: sanctity as strength. Here was a woman who came from obscurity, perhaps a stable girl, perhaps an innkeeper's daughter, who became the mother of emperors and, more importantly, the mother of a faith that would outlast them all. Her journey told every believer, every dreamer, every person on the margins: your beginnings don't define your destiny. That message, subtle yet revolutionary, rewrote the story of greatness itself. Centuries after her death, her name was still whispered in prayer. Her image appeared in mosaics and frescoes across Europe. Artists painted her with a halo of quiet dignity, often holding the cross, the very symbol she was said to have found. Queens, empresses, and noblewomen patterned themselves after her, seeking not only to rule well, but to embody grace, humility, and devotion. In medieval courts, her name became shorthand for a sacred kind of motherhood, not one defined by blood, but by spirit. The mother who raised a Christian emperor became the model for those who sought to raise nations through faith. Even as the centuries passed and empires rose and fell, Helena remained a constant. Her story was told and retold, not just as history, but as a mirror reflecting something timeless: the power of belief to rebuild the world. Because faith, at its core, isn't about walls or crowns. It's about transformation, of hearts, of values, of what a civilization dares to honor. Helena's legacy didn't shout. It whispered. It whispered through the soft glow of candles in the first great churches, through the brushstrokes of artists painting her likeness in the cathedrals of Europe, through the prayers of mothers who saw in her their own strength and struggle. And maybe that's what makes her story endure. Rome's emperors built monuments to themselves, but Helena helped build something that outlasted marble: a conscience. She turned the idea of empire inside out. For the first time, moral virtue, not lineage or might, became the measure of greatness. And in that shift, the Western world began to take shape, because from her influence came not only churches and crosses, but a new moral imagination, one that valued forgiveness over vengeance, charity over pride, and purpose over power. Constantinople would stand for over 1,000 years, glittering with domes and icons, its skyline pierced with the symbols of faith. And though time would erode its stones, Helena's unseen architecture, the one she built in hearts, remained. Her fingerprints are still there today, in every church bell that tolls, in every painting of a sainted mother, in every act of faith that chooses compassion over conquest. She may have begun life in obscurity, but she ended it as something eternal, proof that even in a world obsessed with might, it is faith that truly rebuilds civilizations. So when we think of Constantine, the builder, the conqueror, the emperor, we should also remember the woman who taught him that power means nothing without purpose. Because while he built a new Rome with walls and towers, Helena helped build a new world with grace, mercy, and light. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but the world Helena helped shape still stands, not in marble or gold, but in every act of faith that dares to turn darkness into hope. So who was Helena really? A saint, a strategist, a survivor who turned pain into purpose? Maybe. She was all of these. History often remembers the men who built empires, but Helena built something different. She built meaning. She built connection. She built a bridge between power and compassion, between empire and eternity. What makes Helena remarkable isn't just that she helped shape the early Christian world. It's how she did it. Not through conquest or decree, but through quiet conviction. Not by ruling over others, but by walking among them. She redefined what power could look like. In a world that celebrated dominance, she embodied devotion. In a time when influence meant armies and wealth, Hers came through mercy and grace. Think about that for a second. In an empire that worshipped strength, Helena made humility heroic. She proved that true authority doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it kneels to lift others up, and maybe that's why her story still resonates. Because deep down, we all understand what she understood, that the real test of power is not how much control you have, but how much good you do with it. Helena didn't just build churches, she built symbols of hope. She didn't just collect relics, she preserved belief itself. And she didn't just serve her son's empire, she helped shape the soul of the world that came after it. Imagine her in Jerusalem, an elderly woman walking through the sun-baked streets, surrounded by dust, pilgrims, and whispers of history. She had no army, no titles that mattered here, only faith. And yet that faith would move mountains, or in her case, uncover one of the holiest sites in the world. It's almost poetic. A woman who began life on the margins, perhaps born in a stable, later walking the road to Calvary, the place of the cross, from the humblest beginning to the heart of the greatest story ever told. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not the relics she found, but the transformation she inspired, proving that greatness isn't inherited, it's chosen. That faith, when lived with courage, can outlast empires. Because what survives of Rome today isn't the legions or the palaces. It's the faith Helena helped bring into the light, the same faith that still gathers millions in churches across the world. Walk into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, or the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Rome, and you'll still feel her presence. You'll see pilgrims kneeling on the same stone she once touched. You'll hear prayers whispered into the same air she once breathed. Nearly 2,000 years later, her footsteps still echo, in faith, in architecture, in the very idea that compassion could conquer cruelty. And yet Helena's story isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror, showing us what faith looks like when it's lived, not just preached. In a world still obsessed with status and spectacle, her legacy feels almost radical, because she reminds us that humility isn't weakness, it's strength under control. That devotion isn't naivete, it's courage with purpose. Helena's power didn't come from what she owned. It came from what she believed. And that belief changed the spiritual map of the world. Think of how extraordinary that is. A woman once dismissed for her low birth became a saint invoked by emperors, queens, and pilgrims alike. Her name still adorns churches on every continent. Her image still shines in stained glass, a mother holding a cross, not as a relic of suffering, but as a symbol of redemption. She was, in every sense, the spiritual mother of an empire. But more than that, she became a mother figure to humanity's conscience. A reminder that no matter where you start, your faith, your compassion, and your integrity can leave a mark that outlives you. So when we ask, who was Helena? Maybe the answer isn't found in dusty manuscripts or marble statues. Maybe the answer is found in every act of mercy that refuses to die, every person who chooses faith over fear, every soul who believes that even in a world of emperors and armies, goodness still matters, because that's her true legacy. Not the cross she found, but the light she carried. And in the end, that light outshone every crown, every empire, every monument of stone. Helena began as a woman the world overlooked, and became a woman the world could never forget. Her story isn't just history. It's a reminder that the greatest power on earth is still the power of faith. Every age has its heroes, but not all of them lead armies or wear crowns or have their names carved into stone. Some, like Helena, move through history in silence. Their greatness doesn't roar. It whispers. It whispers in the way they keep believing when the world tells them not to. It whispers in small acts of kindness that ripple across centuries. It whispers in every quiet soul who chooses faith over fear, compassion over pride, and purpose over power. Helena's story began in obscurity, a small town in Bithynia, far from Rome's shining marble. She could never have imagined that one day her footsteps would echo in cathedrals and prayers across the world. But that's the power of faith. It doesn't ask where you were born. It asks what you believe, from a humble stable to an imperial palace to sainthood in the hearts of millions. Helena's journey is living proof that destiny can be rewritten, not by conquest, but by conviction. Music rises slightly, A serene warmth fills the tone. She never commanded legions. She never held political office, and yet, her influence reshaped empires. Because sometimes the mightiest revolutions begin with a whisper, a prayer, a gesture, a quiet choice to keep the light burning in a world of darkness. And maybe that's why her story still matters today. Because even now, we live in an age that often confuses noise with meaning and power with worth. But Helena reminds us that true greatness isn't about how loudly you speak. It's about how deeply you move others. Look around you. Who are the Helenas of your world? The quiet builders, the unseen givers, the people who lift others without asking for credit. Maybe it's a parent who sacrifices quietly, a teacher who believes in a student that everyone else gave up on, a nurse who stays a few extra minutes when no one's watching. These are the people who change the world, not by force, but by faith. Helena's legacy calls us to look for those voices, and to be one of them. Because in every era, humanity depends on those who choose compassion when it's inconvenient, kindness when it's unnoticed, and faith when it's unpopular. Soft pause, the music shifts to a hopeful chord progression. If her story moved you, share it. Not just with a click or a like, but with a thought, a conversation, a spark. Because history isn't just something we remember. It's something we continue. Every act of belief, every moment of courage, every time you choose hope over despair, that's history too. That's how legacies like Helena's keep breathing long after the stones of empires have crumbled. And if you want to keep walking deeper into these stories, to see how Constantine's vision reshaped the Roman world, how one faith rose from persecution to power, and how the echoes of the past still guide us today, stay with us. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and join us for the next chapter of History Mysteries, because sometimes the smallest lives leave the loudest echoes.